The applause roared, but it didn't touch her. She stood on the stage clutching the Pulitzer medal, her knuckles white, her eyes locked on the man in the back row. He was smiling like this moment belonged to him. She forced her lips into a practiced curve, but her stomach tightened. The lights burned hot on her face, yet a chill wrapped around her spine. The host's voice faded into static, replaced by the sound of paper rustling, an echo from 15 years ago when a battered paperback slid across a counter into her trembling hands. She remembered the smell of old ink, the weight of something she wasn't supposed to own. That day had been cold, the kind of cold that made your breath sharp. But the warmth in the clerk's eyes had melted through it. She had thought it was kindness. She had thought it was nothing more. Now, standing under the golden spotlight, the truth hit her with the weight of an avalanche. She whispered to herself, "It started with that book." The man in the back row shifted, folding his arms, his smile tightening into something almost protective. Or possessive. She couldn't tell anymore. A camera flash went off, blinding her for a heartbeat, and in that white glare she saw the dusty bookstore again, saw her smaller self clutching the novel to her chest, saw the moment her life quietly veered toward this stage, and toward him. The applause swelled again, dragging her back to the present. She took a breath that felt heavier than air, and stepped to the microphone. Her voice was steady, but inside, something old and dangerous had started to wake. The award's weight felt unnatural in her hand, as though it belonged to someone else. The host's voice urged her to speak, but she wasn't hearing words anymore, only the sound of a page turning in her mind. She remembered the way the bookstore clerk had smiled that day, his eyes soft but unreadable. She had been cold, hungry, and certain she didn't deserve anything for free. He'd said something casual like it was nothing, and slid the book toward her. But years later, she wondered if it had been planned. If the story inside had been meant for her, designed to plant an idea she couldn't shake. Standing here now, she wondered if the man in the back row had been there all along, watching, waiting. The thought wrapped around her like invisible wire, and she almost forgot to breathe. She gripped the edges of the podium and forced herself to smile. She thanked the judges, the readers, the people who had believed in her. But each word felt like a lie stitched over a raw wound. The man in the back row tilted his head, as if curious how much she would reveal. She thought of that winter afternoon again, the cracked leather counter, the faint hum of an old heater, the smell of second-hand paper. It wasn't just the gift of the book. It was the way he'd looked at her then, like he already knew who she'd become. Her voice wavered, and she swallowed hard, forcing the tremor down. The applause after her opening words felt polite, measured. She wondered if anyone else could feel the weight in the air. The man's gaze didn't break. It pinned her in place, like a needle through fragile paper. She tried to focus on the present, on the award in her hand, but every flicker of the light seemed to pull her back into that cramped bookstore, the book resting between them like a silent pact. The kind of pact you don't realize you've made until years later. She cleared her throat and shifted her stance. She told a brief story about the power of literature, about how a single book can change the course of a life. Her voice softened when she said, "Sometimes a story finds you when you need it most." The audience smiled, some nodding, unaware that every syllable was a blade sliding closer to the truth. She saw the man's fingers drum once on the armrest, slow and deliberate. She wondered if he knew that she was finally ready to open the pages of what had been between them all along. The snow crunched beneath her thin boots as she hurried down the narrow street, breath sharp in the icy air. The small bookstore sat like a shadow at the end of the block, its windows fogged from the inside. She pushed the door open and stepped into warmth that smelled of dust and paper. Shelves leaned like tired old men, sagging under the weight of forgotten stories. Behind the counter, the clerk looked up, his expression unreadable, but not unkind. She hesitated, scanning the tables piled with books she couldn't afford. Her fingers trailed over a cracked spine, and she felt him watching. He asked what she was looking for, but she shook her head. Words felt too heavy. Then, without a word, he reached under the counter and slid a worn paperback toward her. She stared at it, startled. He simply nodded once, as if giving her something that was already hers. Inside, the air felt thick and safe. The old heater hummed softly in the corner, casting a faint orange glow across the wooden floorboards. She looked at the book again. The cover was faded, the corners bent, but it felt solid, important. The clerk leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter. "Take it," he said quietly, as if offering a secret. She opened her mouth to refuse, but the words tangled with the lump in her throat. She didn't remember the last time anyone had given her something without asking for anything back. She nodded once barely, and slipped the book into her bag. She left the shop and stepped into the brittle cold again, pulling her coat tighter. Street lamps flickered weakly along the narrow road, their light pooling in small circles. She glanced back once, through the fogged glass, and saw the clerk still at the counter, watching her. Not in a threatening way, but with the intensity of someone memorizing a moment. She didn't know why it unsettled her, but it did. At home the apartment was dim and cramped, the walls close and tired. Her mother sat at the small kitchen table, staring into a cup of tea that had gone cold. She didn't ask where the book came from, she barely looked up at all. The girl sat on the couch, curling into herself, opening the cover. The first sentence felt like it had been waiting for her all her life. Outside, the city groaned under winter's weight, but inside those pages, something else began to move. Her mother spoke only once that night, her voice low. "Don't stay up too late." The girl mumbled something without looking up. The world in the book was brighter, sharper, more dangerous than the apartment's stale air. She read until her eyes burned, the words sinking deep. She didn't know it yet, but the story was planting roots she'd spend years untangling. Winter blurred into weeks of quiet rituals. School, the walk home, the evenings curled with the book. Her mother worked late shifts, leaving meals wrapped in foil. The book became her anchor, its characters more real than the neighbors she barely spoke to. Each chapter left her hungrier for the next. The clerk's face would flicker in her mind at odd moments, not as a threat, but as a question she couldn't answer. One afternoon, after school, she stopped at the bookstore again. This time, the clerk smiled a little wider, as though he'd expected her. She placed the book on the counter, reluctant to let it go. He asked if she liked it. She said yes, and the word came out too fast, too eager. He pulled another book from the shelf without breaking eye contact, and placed it beside her. From then on, the visits became a rhythm. She would finish one book, return it, and receive another without payment or explanation. Her mother didn't ask, didn't seem to notice. But each story she read sharpened something inside her, something restless. The clerk never pushed conversation, but his quiet attention made her feel seen in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. One evening, she arrived to find the shop nearly empty, the air heavy with the smell of rain on the street outside. The clerk asked her name for the first time. She hesitated, then told him. He repeated it softly, like testing the weight of it. For a moment, it felt like the walls closed in, holding the two of them in a space separate from the rest of the world. That night, she read the new book in one sitting, heart racing at the story's pace. It was darker than the last ones, its characters more flawed, more dangerous. She closed it just before dawn, the city outside still wet and gleaming under street lamps. She wondered if the clerk had chosen it for a reason, and what that reason might be. Spring crept in slowly, but the cold in her apartment never seemed to lift. One afternoon, she arrived home to find her mother pacing, a thin envelope in her hand. Her mother's face was tight, her voice sharper than usual when she asked where the books kept coming from. The question lodged like a splinter. She didn't answer right away, and the silence stretched too long. Her mother finally dropped the envelope on the table, an unpaid bill, and muttered that kindness from strangers always came with a price. The words stuck to her skin like damp clothes. That night, she read in bed, but couldn't shake the thought. Maybe her mother knew something she didn't. A week later, she returned to the bookstore with the latest book finished. She set it on the counter, but before the clerk could hand her another, she asked, "Why are you giving me these?" His expression didn't change, but his hands stilled. He said, "Books belonged with people who needed them." The answer sounded too simple. Something in his eyes said more. That night, she asked her mother if she knew the man at the bookstore. Her mother froze, then pretended not to hear. When pressed, she said he was no one important, and changed the subject to the dishes in the sink. The way she avoided eye contact made it clear there was more to the story. Sleep didn't come easily after that. The next time she entered the bookstore, the clerk was shelving books near the back. She wandered between aisles until she stood beside him. He glanced at her, then quietly asked if her mother still had the green scarf. The question stopped her in place. She had seen that scarf in an old photo, draped around her mother's shoulders. She asked how he knew, but he only said, "Some things you keep because they matter." That night she went searching through drawers until she found the scarf, still folded neatly, smelling faintly of cedar. She traced the fabric with her fingers, wondering if every book she'd read had been a breadcrumb leading here. In the quiet, her mother's door stayed shut. Outside, the city kept breathing, unaware of the story unraveling in their small apartment. The following Saturday, she waited outside the bookstore until the clerk locked up for the night. When he stepped into the cool air, she asked him straight, "How do you know my mother?" He paused, then said they'd known each other long ago. His voice carried both warmth and something heavier, like regret. He didn't explain further, just asked if she liked the books. She nodded, though that wasn't the answer she wanted. Days later, she overheard her mother on the phone, voice low and tight. "She's not ready," her mother said, followed by silence. Then, "You can't just give her pieces and expect her to understand." The words set her pulse racing. She slipped back into her room, heart pounding, clutching the latest book like a lifeline she didn't know how to hold. At the bookstore the next day, she returned the latest book. Before the clerk could hand her another, she asked if he'd known her father. His face changed, just slightly, but enough for her to know the answer. He didn't confirm, didn't deny, only said, "Some stories take time to read." He placed a book in front of her, thicker than any before. She carried the thick book home through the early evening streets, the sky a dull gray. Each step felt heavier than the one before. In her room, she opened it to find a handwritten note on the first page, "For the one who will finish what we began." The handwriting was careful, deliberate, and unfamiliar. She read the first line and felt the room tilt. The words in the note replayed in her mind all night. "We" meant more than one person. It meant her mother and the clerk. It meant a past she'd been living in the shadow of without knowing. By dawn, she knew she couldn't just keep reading. She had to find the missing chapters. The book lay open on her bed, a question she could no longer avoid. The city lights pulsed faintly in the distance as rain began to mist over the quiet rooftop. Elena, now in her mid-30s, stood at the edge, the manuscript clutched in her hands. She inhaled the cold night air, letting the sound of distant traffic settle her racing mind. Below, the streets shimmered under street lamps, each light reflecting in scattered puddles. She whispered to herself, "It's almost time." Her voice carried both resolve and exhaustion, years of struggle compressed into a single breath. She thought of the nights spent hunched over a desk, the sacrifices, the friendships lost, the doubts that almost silenced her. And yet, here she was, staring at the skyline that once seemed unreachable. The rain soaked her hair, streaked her cheeks, and blurred the city view, but not her focus. She traced her fingers along the manuscript's worn edges, feeling every crease as if it were a scar. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she ignored it. This was her moment. A quiet ritual before she stepped into the storm she had been preparing for. "If they're ready for me, they'll see all of me," she murmured, not knowing if she was speaking to the city, her future audience, or herself. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, deep and slow, like a warning, or a drum roll. Morning broke with an amber haze, spilling over the skyline. Elena stepped into the publishing building's marble lobby, the manuscript tucked under her arm. Her boots clicked on the polished floor, each step echoing faintly. She was dressed sharply, but not extravagantly. A dark blazer, fitted trousers, a cream blouse, the armor of someone stepping into a battlefield of words. The receptionist glanced up, offered a polite smile, and gestured toward the elevators. As the mirrored doors closed, Elena caught her own reflection. Older, sharper, with lines that hinted at nights without sleep and years without surrender. The elevator hummed as it climbed. She exhaled slowly, closing her eyes for a brief moment, recalling the voice of her mentor. Your words are your courage. Don't let them edit that out of you. When the doors opened, she stepped into a hallway lined with framed covers of bestsellers, each one a reminder of the stakes. She passed by them without slowing, her pace steady. Outside the conference room, muffled voices could be heard, negotiations in progress. She gripped the manuscript tighter, knuckles whitening. This was no longer just her story. It was the culmination of a lifetime's truth, and she was about to place it on the table. The conference room was large, glass walls revealing the morning sun spilling over the city skyline. Around the long table sat editors, agents, and executives, their faces a mix of curiosity and calculation. Elena entered without hesitation, placing the manuscript in the center. This is not just a book, she began, her voice steady but charged. It's a truth I've carried for decades. One editor leaned back, fingers steepled. Truth is subjective, he said mildly. Elena met his gaze. Not this one. The silence that followed was thick, punctuated only by the faint hum of the air conditioner. She opened the manuscript to the first page, reading aloud a passage that painted her childhood in raw, unflinching strokes. As she spoke, eyes around the table shifted, some leaning in, others hardening. She knew every word was a risk, but the words were not negotiable. By the time she closed the book, the room felt different. One executive cleared her throat, leaning forward. We'll need to discuss the marketability, she said. Elena smiled faintly. I'm here to discuss the truth. Hours passed in tense discussion. Pages were flipped, notes scribbled, objections raised. Elena countered each one with precision, refusing to allow her story to be diluted. At one point, an agent leaned in, voice low but firm. If you soften this chapter, it will sell better. She replied without hesitation. If I soften it, it will be a lie. The air grew heavier as stakes became clear. Finally, silence. Then, the senior editor, a man with gray at his temples, leaned forward. We'll publish it, he said. The decision was not unanimous, but it was final. Elena sat back, her shoulders sinking with relief and quiet triumph. She glanced at the manuscript, now marked with notes and tabs, yet still wholly hers. She didn't smile broadly. Instead, her lips curved slightly, a victory for those who understand the cost of telling the truth. The sun had set by the time Elena stepped outside. The air was crisp, the streets alive with the hum of evening. She walked slowly, the city lights stretching endlessly before her. The manuscript was now in the hands of others, but the story remained hers. She paused at a crosswalk, watching strangers pass, some rushing, some laughing, all living their own stories. For years, she had feared hers would remain buried. Now, it was on the brink of being read by thousands. She pulled her coat tighter around her, not out of cold, but to hold the quiet satisfaction that warmed her. Somewhere deep inside she felt the weight lift, not entirely, but enough to breathe easier. She looked up at the skyline, the buildings lit like sentinels. It's out there now, she whispered, half smiling. And for the first time in years she allowed herself to imagine the next chapter. The launch day arrived with the kind of crisp autumn morning that felt almost scripted. Leaves fluttered down in slow spirals as Elena walked toward the independent bookstore that had agreed to host her first public reading. She held a single copy of her published novel, the fresh ink still carrying that subtle, intoxicating scent of new beginnings. The street outside was lined with early risers sipping coffee, unaware of the storm inside her chest. She reached the door, pausing to steady her breath, recalling the old wooden counter from her teenage years where the clerk had once handed her a battered paperback for free. Now she was returning, not as a quiet girl clutching a gift, but as a woman with something to give back. Inside, shelves leaned under the weight of stories, but her eyes found the small display near the front, her book stacked neatly, its cover glowing under soft track lighting. She traced the embossed letters of her name, feeling both pride and vulnerability swirl together. Somewhere behind her, the store manager cleared his throat gently, signaling it was time. She turned toward the small crowd gathering by the reading corner, her voice still trapped in her chest, but her steps firm. The chairs were filled with faces both familiar and unknown. A few were neighbors, others strangers drawn by curiosity or the promise of free coffee. At the back, she spotted a face that stopped her mid-step. The bookstore clerk, older now, hair silvered, leaning on the same counter as if time had folded in on itself. She wanted to rush over, but the manager was already introducing her. She stepped up to the small podium, her voice catching at first before smoothing into the rhythm of her words. She read from a passage that had lived inside her for decades, a scene of a young girl alone in a room, her world cracked open by a single book. As she spoke, the room seemed to contract until there was only her voice and the silence absorbing it. She risked a glance at the back. The clerk was listening, hands folded, eyes shining with something that looked like quiet recognition. When the reading ended, the applause felt like a wave, not crashing, but enveloping her in warmth. People queued to have their books signed, each face carrying its own story. She wrote her name carefully, adding small personal notes where she could, but her eyes kept drifting toward the counter. Finally, the line thinned, and he approached, holding a copy of her book with hands that had once passed her a gift. "You probably don't remember," he began, voice gravelly with age. "A long time ago, I gave you a book." Her throat tightened, but she smiled. "I remember everything about that day." He chuckled softly. "Guess I made a decent investment." She shook her head. "You gave me more than a book. You gave me a door I didn't know existed." They stood there for a moment, the air heavy with the unspoken truth that sometimes the smallest gestures rewrite entire lives. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted the street in amber light. Elena walked with the clerk to the corner cafe, the air cool enough to see their breaths. They talked about books, about time, about how the world had shifted, and yet some things remained unshakably the same. Over steaming mugs of coffee, he confessed he had often wondered what became of her. She told him the truth, about the nights writing in borrowed light, about the rejections, the moments she almost stopped. He listened without interrupting, his gaze steady and kind. When she finished, he simply said, "You kept going. That's the whole story." She realized then that this meeting wasn't about closure. It was about connection, a circle drawn quietly over years. That night, back in her apartment, Elena placed the signed copy of her own book on the shelf where the old battered paperback had lived for years. She ran her fingers over the spines, lingering on the one that had started it all. Outside, the city hummed with its endless stories, but inside, the quiet felt earned. She sat at her desk, opening a fresh notebook, the first page blank and waiting. The clerk's words echoed in her head. "You kept going. That's the whole story." She smiled, realizing the truth. It wasn't the whole story, not yet. There would be more pages, more risks, more doors she didn't yet see. But for tonight, she allowed herself the rare peace of being exactly where she was meant to be.